In this video, dealing with Chapter 2 in the textbook, we're going to discuss what are called the guidelines for inquiry. So these are sort of some preparatory steps that go into carrying out a successful inquiry. There are going to be 5 of these steps. We'll talk our way through all of them, and then that'll be it for the video. All right, let's get started. So the first step is to identify the issue or the issues that are involved within the inquiry. You've all probably had the experience of talking to people or maybe just listening to other people have a conversation where it seems like they're not even really talking about the same topic. There's the old saying, 2 ships passing in the night, right? Where people are saying things back and forth at each other. They vaguely relate to what the other person is saying, but not really. And, what you're saying to me doesn't seem relevant to me, and what I'm saying to you doesn't seem relevant to you. This usually happens because the actual specific inquiry under question isn't really the same between the two people. People are not yet clear what singular issue is the central one being investigated in the course of the investigation. Now, there are frequently going to be many issues that are sort of relevant or tangentially related, but every inquiry needs to have one central issue that it's oriented around. Let's look at a specific example of this. So let's say we have some very broad topic that I'm inquiring into, and this topic is whether or not public schools should make fruits and vegetables a mandatory part of school lunches. Now that very broad topic is really actually too broad. It's so broad that it would be difficult to inquire into it successfully. We need to narrow it down because there's a whole bunch of issues that are sort of related to or around that topic that just got said. So one potential issue we could investigate is the purely factual question, are fruits and vegetables in fact healthy for children? Presumably that's why they would be mandated, and that's indeed a topic that could be investigated. And we'd have a very different kind of inquiry into that question than we would if, say, we asked maybe a slightly different but closely related question. Are children more likely to eat fruits and vegetables if they're mandatorily included in school lunches? Now, presumably we would only be asking that second question if we'd first established that fruits and vegetables are indeed healthy. But if they are indeed separate questions, and there's going to be different concerns, different kinds of evidence we would need to look at in the course of evaluating between those two issues that we could investigate. And then what I would say is probably the central issue that's contained within that sort of over our original topic is maybe a moral question. Is it right, maybe ethically, morally, something like that, for fruits and vegetables to be mandated by public schools? Right? Is it morally allowable? And again, we'd have to have a very different kind of conversation if we're asking that moral question. Alright, so once you've identified the central issue that you're going to be investigating in some inquiry, and then also maybe grasp some of the sort of subordinate questions or subordinate issues that are sort of going to need to come up in the course of analyzing the central issue, then it's time to actually take all those list of issues that you discovered and figure out what kind of question are you asking and what kind of answer to that question could be acceptable. There's going to be what we're going to call 5 different kinds of sort of judgments that we reach when we're investigating some sort of question, and also then correspondingly 5 different kinds of questions that sort of call for those different kinds of judgments. And you need to sort of match up the right kind of question with the right kind of conclusion or judgment, and it'll tell you a lot about the kind of evidence that you need to answer the question by figuring out what kind of question it actually is, what kind of judgment you need to reach. So we'll have 5 of these. The first kind of judgment that we're going to talk about is what's called a factual judgment, and then factual questions. And that issue number 1 from the group we were just talking about with school lunches, that's an example of a factual question. The question of whether or not fruits and vegetables are indeed healthy. This is simply a matter of fact. And what I mean by a matter of fact, all we need to do to answer this question is simply describe the world. Describe how the world is now. Describe how the world was in the past, maybe. Not really future. That's going to be something else, really, if we're talking about the future. But if you're talking about how the world was in the past or how it just is right now, that's a factual question. Fruits and vegetables, are they healthy? We just need to describe the world. We can answer that question. Next up, there are what are called evaluative questions and evaluative judgments. There's actually going to be 3 different kinds of these, so we'll treat each of them separately. But the reason why they're all evaluative is what they're all going to have in common. They're all describing, in some sense or another, what would be good or bad to take place. The difference will be the kind of goodness or the kind of badness that we're talking about will vary through the three different kinds. So let's start with our next specific kind of judgment, what are called instrumental judgments. These are questions like the second one that we were discussing with school lunches, where we're trying to, in effect, figure out how are we going to bring about some desired outcome about in the world. So if we're asking, are children more likely to eat fruits and vegetables if we make them mandatory, we're asking sort of a question about, is it going to work? Is this plan going to be successful? Is it going to bring about the outcome that we want it to bring about? So unlike factual question, instrumental questions are sort of futural. They're kind of predictive. Will what we do right now work in the future? Is it going to give us what we want in the future? Is it a good idea in that sense? And that's the sense in which it's evaluative. The next kind of evaluative question and judgment that we'll talk about is what are called ethical judgments. Unsurprisingly, these are where we're talking about right and wrong, right? Good or bad. And so if we were to ask the third of those questions that we looked at, that would be an example of an ethical judgment. So should school districts, in a moral sense, make fruits and vegetables mandatory for all students? Is that morally allowable? Is it a morally good action to take? Right? That is an example of an ethical judgment. We're talking about right and wrong. The last kind of evaluative judgment that we'll talk about today is what are called aesthetic judgments. Aesthetic, think we're talking about things like beauty or taste, things of that sort, where the issue, the kind of good or bad we're talking about isn't so much kind of moral good or bad, but almost a kind of like beauty question. So let's bring in a new question. So let's say we're looking at, is the new Taylor Swift album a good or bad album? We're talking about good and bad, so that's why it's still within the evaluative category. But it's not really a morally. We're not asking, is it a morally excellent album? What we're asking, is it a beautiful in some sense of the term album, or is it ugly in some sense of the term album? When we're talking about beauty, ugliness in this very broadly conceived sense, that's an example of an aesthetic question, and then an aesthetic judgment that will be used to answer it. So maybe say, yes, indeed, this is a beautiful album. And then the last kind of judgment that we'll talk about today are what are called interpretive judgments. So these are different from factual judgments. Factual judgments are just describing what's going on. Evaluative judgments are deciding, in effect, is what's going on good or bad? Is it going to work? Is it morally right or wrong? Is it beautiful or ugly? Interpretive judgments and interpretive questions are asking and looking at the question of what things mean. What's the significance of things in a way that goes beyond merely just describing what literally happened. And so let's use the Taylor Swift album again as the example. If we wanted to know what the new Taylor Swift album means, what Taylor Swift is saying, that would be an example of an interpretive judgment, right? We're going beyond just literally the album. Maybe we could get the lyric list or whatever. I guess that would be a factual judgment. What are the lyrics to the Taylor Swift album? But we want to know more than just what those lyrics just are. We want to know, what do they mean? What's their significance? What do they tell us about the world? What's Taylor Swift trying to say through the album? Anything like that is an interpretive judgment. We're not just looking at what the facts are, we're trying to say what those facts mean, how they're significant, what relevance we can draw for them looking forward into the future. The reason it's so important to identify precisely what kind of question you're asking and what kind of judgment will be a suitable answer to that question is that we're going to use really different kinds of evidence for these different kinds of questions. If you're engaged in a factual inquiry, what matters is simply your description of the world. Anything that's not really describing how the world is isn't super relevant in a factual inquiry. On the other hand, if we're engaged in an ethical study, maybe facts about the world will indeed be relevant. They'll be part of how we reach our ethical evaluation, but just listing all the facts will never be enough. We need to go beyond the facts to determine in an ethical way what's the good or bad thing to do on the basis of those facts. Similarly, with an interpretive question, again, just listing off the facts, helpful, but not going to be enough to actually tell us what those facts mean, how they're significant. And then indeed also, same thing with sort of the instrumental judgments, right? And the aesthetic judgments. We're not just need to know the facts might be helpful, but we need to go beyond them in some sense to, again, an instrumental judgment, determine how can we best act on the basis of those facts, or in a aesthetic judgment, are those facts, is the situation good, bad, beautiful, ugly in that regard. And so distinguishing the different kinds of questions is really valuable because it's going to tell you what kind of evidence you're going to need and what kind of answer you're going to need to give to the questions. That'll help you figure out what's relevant, what's not relevant. All right, so those first two questions are sort of preparatory. It's where you basically sort of make very clear to yourself what the inquiry is going to be about so that you can carry out well going forward. The third and fourth step are both sort of examples of fact-finding, in a sense, of gathering some relevant information before you begin evaluating that information. So the third step of an inquiry is to identify all the sort of relevant reasons and arguments that people give on various sides of the issue or question that you're investigating. What do people say about the topic? And, the goal here, ideally, will be to find a lot of different things people say. So let's say, again, for example, we're looking at that third question that we were talking about earlier. Is it sort of morally right or morally allowable for fruits and vegetables to be made a mandatory part of public school lunches? So if we were to take stock of the arguments, sort of pro and con, that people make with regard to that question, you'll have some people saying that yes, indeed, it's morally obligatory that school districts do this, because school districts will have a moral obligation to promote health amongst the student body, maybe. But you also might find a sort of con position, right, where someone's sort of arguing against this claim, saying, no, actually, it should be up to individual students and maybe up to the parents of individual students what students eat. We need to protect student autonomy, freedom, and to choose what they eat, what they put inside their body, so there shouldn't be anything mandatorily part of school lunches. At this point, you're not really evaluating if these are good or bad arguments. You just want to know roughly what kind of things people are saying so that you know where to further take your investigation when you go to the next steps. One last note about this third question. So there's going to be, in a lot of cases, an enormous number of positions people take or sort of arguments people make. So you'll want to probably narrow your focus down to things that are especially good arguments, especially prominent arguments from maybe the most qualified of sources. If you had to just look at every single thing someone has said about a topic, right, particularly nowadays with the internet, Twitter, Reddit, all those things, it'll take you forever. So focus especially on sort of the best, most authoritative, the most qualified sort of sources. What do they say in these with regard to the question that you're looking at? Next, you need to identify any sort of relevant context or background information that could be relevant in sort of analyzing the arguments that you looked at or discovered in that step 3. So things like maybe if we're looking at this question of mandatory school lunches, we want to know things about demographic information about the student body. We want to know maybe about what are the current lunch options at the school. We want to know whether or not there are nutrition-related health problems in the school district. Things like that could be relevant to our sort of moral evaluation, sort of relevant background information. You want to know all that background information so that you can sort of do a better job with your evaluation. And the last step, so step number 5, is that you now take all this information you've gathered, and then you evaluate the reasons, the arguments that you've been presented with, the evidence that you've acquired to reach the reasoned judgment that will conclude the inquiry. In effect, we're not really going to talk about this last step today, because this last step is basically the rest of the class, what the rest of the class is going to be about, right? But this is indeed the last step, actually reaching a conclusion, using all that information you've gathered, analyzing it, figuring out what's important, what's not. Alright, that'll do it for this video. Going through chapter 2 in the textbook. It's still a little bit unclear, based on the time that I filmed this video, whether or not we're going to be holding face-to-face instructions for the next video, or for the next chapter in the book, or if we'll still be doing remote learning. I'll try to keep you all updated as soon as I learn anything about that. Otherwise, yep, we will have our first exam based on chapters 1 and 2. We'll talk about that during the class sessions a little bit. And yep, otherwise, I will see you in class. Have a good one. Bye.